What if the only person who could heal a billionaire's silent daughter was the boy everyone looked down on? The morning air felt heavy when Aiden Brooks walked into the school courtyard holding a worn-out backpack that told the world how poor he was, but no one understood the quiet strength he carried inside him, and no one cared to see it. Isabella Sterling sat alone on the far bench, the girl who had not spoken a word in 10 long years, frozen in a silence that even the richest doctors could not break, and yet every student feared her because they feared her father more than they cared about her pain. Edward Sterling had already warned the school that no one should get close to his daughter, especially kids like Aiden, because in his mind, poor black boys were trouble before they even opened their mouths, and his racism lived in every rule he forced on the school. Mrs. Lane watched everything from the classroom window, praying that one day Isabella might find a reason to speak again, but she had no idea that the reason was walking quietly across the courtyard that very morning. Aiden noticed Isabella's shoelace stuck beneath the bench, and he bent down to pull it free, not knowing that this tiny moment was about to shake the entire Sterling empire. Across the yard, students whispered that the billionaire's daughter was dangerous to approach, but Aiden ignored them because he could see something in her eyes that no one else cared to see, a loneliness deeper than silence itself. Isabella looked at him terrified because no one had ever come that close without permission, and yet for the first time in years, her fingers stopped trembling and she watched him with a softness no one knew she still had. Aiden gave a small smile, the kind that came from a gentle soul, not from confidence, and placed the freed shoelace softly beside her foot without saying a word, because he understood silence better than most. The courtyard went completely still, as if the world itself had held its breath, and Isabella shifted her gaze toward him so slowly it felt like time cracked open around them. Mrs. Lane gasped from the window because she saw something she had not seen in Isabella in a decade, a spark, a response, a tiny piece of life returning to her eyes, and Aiden became the first person she looked at without fear. At that exact moment, Edward Sterling arrived in a black SUV, stepping out like a king who owned every inch of the school, and when he saw Aiden near his daughter, his face twisted into disgust so sharp it could cut stone. He stormed toward them shouting, but Isabella's eyes didn't leave Aiden's face, as if her silence knew him long before she had ever seen him, and the billionaire father had no idea he was witnessing the beginning of a miracle he could not control. Students backed away, sensing the storm coming, and yet Aiden stood firm, not out of bravery, but out of the strange calm that always lived inside him, the calm that Isabella somehow understood. Edward grabbed Aiden's wrist, harshly accusing him of harassing his daughter, but Isabella suddenly flinched for the first time in years, showing emotion in a way none of them expected, and Mrs. Lane ran outside trying to stop the billionaire from humiliating the boy. Edward shouted that poor boys like Aiden had no right to breathe the same air as his daughter, and his cruel words echoed across the courtyard, reminding everyone that money never taught him kindness. Yet Isabella kept looking at Aiden like her eyes were trying to speak a truth her voice had forgotten, and Mrs. Lane realized something powerful was happening, something the billionaire could not stop. And as the tension cracked through the air, Aiden whispered softly, "It's okay, I wasn't hurting her," and though Isabella did not respond, her heartbeat steadied for the first time in 10 years. Mrs. Lane stepped between them, demanding Edward release the boy, and the billionaire hesitated, because he saw something he had never seen before. His daughter had reacted to someone, a poor black boy, he thought was worthless. Edward's rage turned to confusion, and he let go slowly, unaware that this single moment was the beginning of a story that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about love, healing, and human worth. And as Isabella watched Aiden walk away, her lips moved just slightly, almost forming a sound, almost breaking the silence she had lived in for a decade, and no one except Mrs. Lane saw it happen. If you want to know what happens when a billionaire father tries to keep apart the only boy who can heal his daughter, make sure you subscribe, and tell me if Chapter 2 should continue. Aiden Brooks walked away slowly from the courtyard, unaware that Isabella Sterling's barely moving lips had already shaken the world around her, because every staff member watching from the windows had seen the impossible, and they knew something had changed forever. Mrs. Lane rushed to Isabella, trying to comfort her, but the girl's eyes did not blink and did not move away from the path Aiden had taken, as if her silence wanted to follow him. Edward Sterling stood frozen, his hand trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a confusion he refused to admit, because he had spent years building walls around his daughter, only to discover those walls cracked the moment a poor black boy touched her shoelace. Students whispered loudly, now saying that Isabella had reacted for the first time, and the courtyard buzzed with a strange electricity that none of them had felt before. Mrs. Lane gently knelt beside the girl, saying, "Isabella, sweetheart, breathe slow, it's okay, you're safe." But the girl wasn't looking at anyone except the boy fadding behind the school doors. Edward barked orders at teachers, demanding Isabella be taken home immediately, as if removing her from the school could erase the truth he just witnessed. But Mrs. Lane stepped forward, braver than she ever dared to be, and said, "Sir," she responded to him, "we need to understand this." Edward snapped back angrily, saying, "There is nothing to understand. He is a poor boy who got too close, and I will not allow this school to encourage such nonsense." But his words shook with insecurity, because deep down he knew he was lying to himself. Meanwhile, Aiden walked down the hallway, feeling the sting of humiliation in his wrist, where the billionaire had grabbed him, yet he also felt something warm in his chest, something he couldn't explain, a strange connection he had never felt before. Inside the courtyard, Isabella suddenly stood up without anyone helping her, and Mrs. Lane gasped, because Isabella had not risen so quickly in years, her movements usually slow, fragile, hesitant. But now she took a step toward the doors Aiden had vanished behind. Edward rushed in front of her, blocking her way, but Isabella's face showed something far more powerful than obedience. For once it showed desire, it showed one, it showed her choosing. "Mrs. Lane whispered softly to Edward, so she is trying to follow him. Please let her make this choice." And Edward's jaw tightened as his pride battled with the truth staring him in the face. Isabella gently reached forward, touching her own wrist exactly where Edward had grabbed Aiden earlier, and it was the first time in a decade she had communicated through movement, something intentional, something emotional, and Mrs. Lane nearly cried. Edward stepped aside, but not willingly more, because he had no idea how to handle the look in his daughter's eyes, and he hated feeling powerless. Isabella walked toward the school building slowly, like each step was rewriting the story of her life, and teachers watched silently, afraid to breathe, afraid to interrupt a miracle they couldn't explain. Aiden reached the water fountain in the hallway, trying to calm down, when he heard soft footsteps behind him, and he turned expecting a teacher. But instead he saw Isabella standing a few feet away, staring at him with tears glistening in her eyes. Aiden froze, whispering hi again, not expecting anything but silence. Yet Isabella took another step closer, her fingers shaking, and Mrs. Lane, who had followed carefully, stopped far behind them, giving the two children space to breathe. Aiden gently smiled, saying, "I didn't mean to get you in trouble, I just wanted to help," and Isabella's chest rose sharply, as if something inside her tried to break through 10 years of locked silence. Her lips parted slightly, a soundless breath pushed out, and Mrs. Lane covered her mouth in shock, because she had not seen that much effort from Isabella in years, and she realized Aiden wasn't just soothing, he was unlocking something buried deep inside the girl. But before Isabella could try again, Edward's voice thundered down the hallway, ordering everyone to back away, and he pulled his daughter aside with fear disguised as anger, while she kept looking back at Aiden, as if she was being taken away from the only light she had found in a decade. Edward dragged her toward the exit, refusing to believe a boy he judged as worthless could be the key his daughter needed. But Mrs. Lane walked straight to Aiden with teary eyes, saying, "Don't give up on her. You did something no one else could do today. You reached her heart." Aiden nodded quietly, still shaken, but something inside him felt sure that this wasn't the end, that Isabella would find her way back to him again, because the connection they shared was stronger than the billionaire's fear. And as the day ended, the entire school whispered about the boy who made the silent girl almost speak, and Edward Sterling fought a battle in his mind, terrified of losing control, terrified of the truth, terrified that his daughter needed someone he had spent his life looking down on. If you're ready to see what happens when Isabella defies her father for the first time in 10 years, then hit subscribe and tell me to continue with Chapter 3 right now, because the real story is only beginning. Aiden froze as Edward Sterling's angry steps echoed across the hallway, and Isabella tightened her small hand around his wrist with silent fear, while Mrs. Lane whispered for him to stay calm, because this moment could break everything they had built so far. And Edward's cold voice filled the room as he demanded to know why a poor black boy was touching his daughter. But Isabella suddenly stepped in front of Aiden like a fragile shield, trembling yet determined, and her father's shock was so strong that he momentarily forgot to breathe, because Isabella had not protected anyone in 10 long years, and Edward's face twisted with anger when he accused Aiden of tricking her, while Aiden stood quietly with steady eyes, refusing to show fear, even though the weight of racism pushed against his chest. And Mrs. Lane desperately tried to explain that Aiden was helping Isabella, but Edward snapped that children from those neighborhoods always bring trouble, and Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head violently, trying to say something, but her voice still couldn't come out, and Aiden stepped forward with slow, gentle courage, telling Edward that he didn't want anything except for Isabella to feel safe, and those words hit Edward like a strike, because no one had ever spoken to him with such calm honesty, especially a kid he believed to be beneath him, and the tension in the room grew so heavy that even the air felt tight, until suddenly Isabella grabbed Aiden's hand again and dragged him toward the music room, where she pushed the piano bench forward with shaking hands, pleading silently through her eyes for him to play, and Aiden understood the moment like instinct, so he sat down and pressed the soft keys, letting a warm, simple melody flow through the room like a heartbeat, while Isabella stood close, breathing quickly as memories pulled her backward and forward at the same time until her lips trembled, as if a buried voice was trying to rise, and Edward watched from the doorway, fighting confusion, fear, and disbelief, because he had spent millions on the world's best therapists, but never once had he seen his daughter react this way, and Mrs. Lane placed a hand on Edward's arm, telling him to look closely, because this moment was different, and Aiden kept playing with a softness that wrapped around Isabella like a blanket, until she leaned forward and whispered one small trembling word that cracked the entire world open as she said Aiden, and the room fell silent as Edward's knees almost gave out, because it had been 10 years since he last heard his daughter speak, and the one person who unlocked her was the boy he had rejected, judged, and insulted. And as Isabella whispered Aiden's name again and again, Edward Sterling understood something he never expected, which was that the child he feared was the child his daughter needed most. And if you felt this moment in your heart, then stay with Aiden Brooks and Isabella Sterling, because the next chapter will change everything, so make sure you follow and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Edward Sterling stood frozen as Isabella kept whispering Aiden's name with trembling courage, and Aiden slowly turned toward her with soft, steady eyes, knowing that her first words in 10 years were not an accident, but a connection born from trust and pain and healing, and Isabella reached out and hugged him tightly, surprising everyone, because she had never touched anyone outside her father and teachers since the trauma, and Mrs. Lane covered her mouth with shaking hands as tears streamed down her face, knowing she was witnessing a miracle that no therapy session had ever achieved, and Edward stepped forward with slow, uncertain steps as his heart cracked open in a way he had never allowed, because the sight of his daughter holding a poor black boy shattered every wall he had built, and he whispered Isabella's name, but she didn't go to him. She held Aiden even tighter, as if telling the world that this boy was her safety, her anchor, her voice, and Edward felt shame flood through him like cold water as he realized how harshly he had judged Aiden just because of his skin and his poverty, and Aiden gently released Isabella and turned to Edward with a kindness that Edward didn't feel he deserved. And he said, "She's stronger than she knows, sir," and Edward's voice broke as he whispered, "Thank you, Aiden," because those were words he had never said to anyone below his social class, and especially not to a black boy. And Isabella walked to her father slowly and placed Aiden's hand into Edward's hand, as if forcing them to see each other clearly, without fear, without pride, and Edward looked at their joined hands and understood that all his money, all his power, and all his beliefs could never give his daughter what Aiden had just given her, which was freedom. And when Aiden prepared to step back, afraid he was crossing a line, Edward surprised everyone by kneeling down to his level and saying, "I was wrong about you and I am sorry," and Aiden nodded quietly, because forgiveness came naturally to him, and Isabella leaned on Aiden's shoulder again, speaking her second word, "Papa," which made Edward break down completely as his daughter's fragile voice returned piece by piece, and Aiden smiled, gently helping her stay calm, while Mrs. Lane whispered that this moment would change their lives forever. And the school soon learned that Isabella had spoken again, and people whispered in disbelief when they discovered the truth that the boy mocked for being poor and black was the reason she found her voice, and Edward Sterling used his power to protect Aiden from that day onward, making sure no one ever disrespected him again. And on the final day of school, Isabella stood with Aiden holding his hand without fear, and when the sun fell across their faces, she whispered, "Thank you, Aiden," loud enough for the world to hear, and that moment taught everyone watching that healing sometimes comes from the most unexpected hearts. And if this story touched your soul, then remember to follow and subscribe for more, because Aiden Brooks and Isabella Sterling proved one powerful lesson, that kindness, not money, not power, not status, is what truly changes the world.